Being a full-time content creator has a lot of perks, but keeping up with a competitive chess career is not one of them. Ah! 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 It's time to change that. I've started training again and will be competing in the Reykjavik Open. My main goal is to regain confidence in my chess abilities and scrub off the rust. So today, I'll be reviewing a game that I played in this same event 4 years ago against a grandmaster. I always struggle to not be afraid when I play such high-rated opponents.
We're gonna get like, dude, we're gonna get a GM. I'm not. Ah!
Hopefully today's analysis will remind me that I can play at a high level and remind all of us that while we should respect higher-rated opponents, we should not fear them. I was playing against Grandmaster Marcel Konarak from Poland, and leading up to the game, I did, 2 to 3 hours of preparation for this specific opponent with my coach, Grandmaster Hammer. This man had played e4 for most of his games. And you know what he played when I sat down? D4. All of that preparation out the window. I was sitting blind and I didn't like it because openings is one of the areas that I'm least confident in when it comes to my chess. I think I never really liked studying opening theory because I found it boring and a lot of memorization, but I'm a crammer, so I do love looking up my opponent and then trying to figure out what they play. But here, I was not gonna have my computer and Grandmaster coach assisted opening repertoire, and I would need to figure it out on the board. So I did what I usually do. Knight f6, I usually play King's Indians, and he played the line I hate playing against the most. Bishop f4, and you are thinking, hey, is it gonna be a London? Maybe, maybe. Nope, even worse. He played e4. And here, white has a really strong center, and a plan that has always annoyed me, which is trying to get the bishop on h6. I played c6, and if he plays bishop h6, you castle, you have this trade-off, and even though it's considered okay, it's a little bit uncomfortable because you trade this bishop that's supposed to be protecting your king and also putting pressure on white, and now I feel like my king is more likely to get attacked. White's gonna castle queenside and then start marching their pawns over. Luckily for me, he didn't play the line that I hated, and he played instead knight f3. And here I thought, is there any way to just make sure he doesn't play bishop h6, or if he does, make it less annoying to play against? And on top of that, I thought, if there was a way we could somehow trade queens, I would prefer that, less complications. I'm playing a grandmaster, I'm playing with the black side of the pieces. Let's, get into a little endgame, why not? So I played queen a5, and queen a5 prevents bishop h6 because I could just recapture, queen takes, and now the knight on c3 is pinned, and I can capture e4, which would lead to an advantage for black because there's no good way to defend this since the queen cannot come back to d2. So that's why he didn't play bishop h6. He instead played bishop to d3, another normal developing move. So I continued with bishop g4. I liked the idea of trading on f3 and giving white a bad pawn structure, and I thought since he put his bishop on d3, he wouldn't want to move back to e2 because then he would have lost a tempo. Here, he got aggressive. He pushed e5. You're always waiting to see at what point is white gonna push when they have this strong center. And I guess it was time. I didn't really love d takes e5 because after knight takes e5, I was no longer putting pressure on the knight. Then he would have his knight positioned in the center. And I could try challenging it with things like knight bd7, but he could always recapture with the bishop. So I was trying to find another option. What I settled on was knight d5. The idea here was to put pressure on the bishop on f4 as well as on the knight on c3. But I did have to be careful about one scary line. What happens after e takes d6? The reason why this is the scariest is because it's attacked twice and only defended once. Usually when you're trying to calculate, a good tip is look at the most forcing lines first or look at the scariest lines first if there's anything that could cause you to lose material. The reason why I didn't think this would be that scary for white is because after e takes d6, I would first take on f3 to try and ruin his pawn structure over here. And then I would capture the bishop on f4 because I'm trying to get rid of one of the defenders on d6. After queen takes d4, I would recapture on d6. And I thought that after queen takes d6, if I play knight bd7, We both castle. Yes, I'm down a pawn, but look at his pawn structure. He has 2 double pawns, an isolated pawn on h2, and I'm probably going to be able to win back a d4 or one of these pawns in the future. I thought the compensation would be worth it. So returning to the position, I wasn't scared of e takes c6, and the next move I considered was the one he played, which was knight takes d5, and I got my wish of trading off those queens. I will add a caveat in there. Often when you're playing a higher rated player, you think that if you're going to trade pieces, that's going to be a draw. That is obviously not true. I will say sometimes it is comforting. I finally got to trade off queens. He recaptured. I finally took back the knight. I wasn't going to be down a piece. And he took on d6. I have 2 options here. I can take on d6 or I can take on d4. Which one do you think is better? Okay, I don't know why I ask people. It makes me feel like I'm Dora, but this is me attempting to be educational. So for the one person who paused the video, good job. Obviously, I want to take on d4 here. The reason, I'm also putting pressure on b2, and if he takes on e7, which is what he ended up doing, I will be able to win this pawn back and I'll have equal material. So how did I do this? I played knight c6, a developing move that's also putting pressure on e7. He kicked my bishop away, probably because he wanted to put his knight on f3 at some point, and you know, he wasn't crazy about the double pawns. I don't blame him. So I played bishop to e6. Here he pushed away my other bishop, bishop to c5, putting yet another threat on e7. He castled and I finally recaptured my pawn. Here, the material was even. That being said, even though the queens were off the board, this is still a tricky position to play. I have an isolated pawn on d5, which means it's going to be a weakness. Usually when you have an isolated pawn, you don't want to be getting into the endgame because isolated pawns become weaker towards the end of the game. So that would be something that I'd have to take care of. The other issue, I kind of had some holes around my king side. It's not that big a deal because he doesn't have a queen to attack with, but it's one of those things that sits in the back of my mind and makes me a little bit uncomfortable as I'm playing. He played knight f3. He was positioning his knight to a better square. I finally got my castle in, and now he played rook fe1, putting his rook on an open file and also putting pressure on my bishops. If it was his turn to move, he would play something like knight g5, attacking my bishop on e6 and also putting pressure on the bishop on e7. I did not want to trade off my bishops. The bishop pair is generally considered stronger than a bishop and a knight. Some people will put the bishop pair value at around 6.5 instead of 6 points. So it was one of those things that I wanted to keep on the board unless I absolutely had to trade it. So here I played bishop f6 just to get my bishop off of the line of fire, and also bishop g7 wouldn't be a bad square to reposition my bishop. It would take care of my whole problem and also look towards the long diagonal, so placing my bishop on a better position than it was before. Here he played bishop b5. I wasn't too afraid of the bishop taking my knight on c6 because I would recapture with the pawn and then I wouldn't have an isolated pawn on d5. So instead I tried to push the bishop away, and of course his plan wasn't to take my knight. He played bishop a4, I shoot him away once more, and then he played bishop b3. This was his entire plan. He was trying to reposition his bishop to put pressure on my weak d5 pawn. So I played rook a d8. I was in defensive mode. I was trying to hold together my position here. Now he played bishop g5, offering a trade. And again, I don't want to do too many trades because the more trades I do, the worse my isolated pawn is going to be. He was really playing strategic chess, which is what you would expect from a grandmaster. That being said, I didn't have a choice to not trade him because my bishop was pinned to my rook. So I decided to take knight takes, and here I played rook fe8 to defend my bishop one more time. And again, I'm not worried that he's going to take because I would bring one of my pawns towards the center and then I wouldn't have an isolated pawn. So what do you do here as white? You keep bringing your pieces into action. He brought in his rook onto the semi-open file, semi because there's only one pawn on it. Here I decided, you know what? Even if he's not going to take my bishop, this knight is a little bit annoying because it's keeping my rook tied into e8. Let's just get rid of it. I pushed h6 and the knight went back to f3. And here I was facing a threat. I'm gonna just make a random move so that I could show you what white was threatening. White was threatening to take on d5. I can't take with the bishop because rook takes e8 check, rook takes, and then rook d5, and he ends up being a pawn here, finally winning that isolated pawn. And if I would have taken with the rook, the same thing would have happened. So I had to defend against this pin somehow. So I played rook e7, and now that sack wouldn't work anymore because my knight was defending my rook. Here he continued with knight d4. He put his knight on one of the best squares for him. He's putting it in the center of the board. It's an outpost, meaning that none of my pawns could ever kick out the knight. It was also defended by a pawn and a rook. I decided I didn't want to trade off my knight. Again, I was generally trying to not trade off pieces. Instead, I played knight a5, just trying to not trade off my knight, still holding the c6 square, looking towards c4 in the future, and also putting pressure on the bishop on b3, not that I wanted to trade. Here he played bishop c2, and it looks like he's trying to not trade off the bishop, but what he's actually doing is threatening to take on g6. So let's say it was his move here. He would take on g6, and I can't recapture because then he can take on e6 and he wins a pawn again. He was constantly putting pressure on me. So instead I played rook d e8, doubling my rooks and defending the bishop one more time. Here he played a4. He was trying to open up the position. And the cool thing about playing a higher rated player is that the pressure is on them to force and win. It was an endgame. Even though the computer evaluation was saying it was pretty much equal, it was a lot more icky for me to play. And what I mean by that is I didn't really have obvious plans and my position was stuck. So it was on him to try to force open the position and create some kind of plan. I didn't want to take on a4 here because after bishop takes a4, I now have another isolated pawn and I don't want to move my rook away. This is the best position for it. I want to keep defending on e6. And if I'd play something like bishop d7, then there'd be so many trades on the board, which as I mentioned, would not be good for me. So instead, I played bishop d7 to defend the pawn on b5. He traded, I took, and he grabbed my pawns. And here, story of this game, I have more pawn weaknesses. These two pawns were isolated. I knew that it would be tricky to try to draw this game, even though the material was equal. Played rook a1, bringing his rook to another open file, attacking my knight on a5, and forcing me to play knight c4. Here he played b3 to kick my knight away onto a worse square. I played knight d6 to double defend on b5. Here he played king f1. He just wanted to make sure that if his knight ever moved, I wouldn't ever get rook to e2. So I developed my king as well. In the endgame, the kings are very important pieces. And again, I didn't really have a lot of moves here, so any small change in the position that would improve where my pieces are, I would take. Here he played rook a7, just creating some kind of pin on my bishop, placing his rook on a better square as well, and maybe potentially in the future having some kind of plan to attack my pawns. I played king f8 to make sure that my bishop was not pinned to continue defending the rook, and I also had started calculating against his next move, rook c7, with the idea of playing a move like rook c5. And I'll show you what would have happened if I just stood still. So let's say I continued moving my king. He would first play bishop d3, putting pressure on my pawn on b5, with the idea of moving his rook to c5, putting pressure on both of these two pawns, which is what he wants to try to do because they're weak. And of course, I would be stuck defending them, but this is the kind of the position that white would be able to slowly grind a pawn off of me. So here, I decided to sacrifice a pawn. I pushed b4. He took the pawn, and now I played knight b5, forcing a trade. I ended up calculating this entire variation, thinking that here, I should be able to hold a draw. Even though I sacrificed one pawn, because my king is more advanced than his king, I will be able to recapture one of these pawns, and then with just one minor piece on the board for both of us, and both of us having two isolated pass pawns, I should be able to hold a draw. And the computer evaluation here was 0.4. So the computer was agreeing that this should be a draw. He played king e1. I played knight c6, attacking the pawn on b4. Since it's on the dark square, there's no way for the light squared bishop to defend. So his only move was b5. And now I had knight d4, again attacking the pawn. Let's say he tried to defend it with a move like bishop e2. Well, then I would just take the other pawn, no problem. So instead, he pushed b6. The crazy thing about this position is that I had calculated the line back when I pushed b4. Back then, and my instinct, I was about to immediately play king c6, which would draw the game. I sat on this position for about 30 minutes or so. I ended up miscalculating an 11 move variation, thinking that king c6 would lose, and I instead played king c5, which actually lost. Honestly, even remembering it is very sad because I would have been so excited to get a draw with the black pieces against the Grandmaster. I had grinded this entire game. I was so close to getting the draw and I still wasn't really believing that I could get it. I'll show you what I calculated against King C6. After King C6, the only variation I was afraid of was Bishop F3. Here I thought that I would take the pawn. I ended up looking at this and thinking that the white king would get my pawns before I do. I totally miscalculated, when really, I'll just play out the moves quickly, this position would have ended up in a draw. It was so close. But instead, I played King C5, which lost the game. He could play B7 here. There wasn't a way for me to catch this pawn without losing one of my pawns. So I played Knight C6 to hold him from promoting on B8. He started bringing his king towards the center, and I was trying to keep his king from coming too close. If I had played a move like King B6, he would have played Bishop F3, and I would have ended up losing this pawn or having to come back and the position would have transposed. So I played King D4. Didn't really matter what I played here. I was already lost. I'll just show you guys how to win this from the white perspective. He pushed B4. I can't take because I'm too busy trying to hold B8 so that he doesn't promote a pawn. So I just played my knight to B8, trying to hold these two passed pawns. Here, his plan is to try to bring his king to C7 so that he could promote. And the problem is if my king tries too hard to defend against that, then his king can just start going for my other pawns. So he played Bishop A4. I just pushed F6. I didn't really have a lot of moves here. With this move, he was basically holding my king from coming any closer to his pawn. I played F5. He pushed H4 just to stop me from going forward. I did my best here. I was trying to push the pawns. Again, there was nothing I could have done. I just want to show how he was able to get his king closer. I tried pushing my pass pawn, but there was going to be basically no way to progress here. So let's say I can't push D3 anymore because he takes the pawn. So I just move my king away. He does as well. I try to hang on to this pawn. He keeps pushing. It's sad to look at. And then in this position, he's defending his bishop. I cannot take it because I'll lose. He's holding the D5 square, which is the only square that could continue protecting my pawn. So I move my king away. He takes it, King G5. And here I resigned because he was going to come with his king to C7. So I lost the game because of one mistake. I had spent hours preparing and playing all of it to amount to nothing. That's why chess is such a brutal game, and that's why I feel kind of crazy to want to get back into competitive chess, but I miss it. I miss the feeling of self-improvement. I miss the feeling of thinking about nothing except for chess for a week straight, because it's kind of like meditation and it clears your mind. With this game, I still feel like I played and defended well against a grandmaster, and had I not missed that one mistake, maybe the result would be different, and hey, maybe this year it will. I'll be starting my first game on March 29th. I will be streaming all of the games with live commentary from Grandmaster Hammer, and I'll also be posting recaps on YouTube every day, so turn on your notifications if you want to follow. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that your own chess improves as well.